A dog finds a baby in the trash and rushes to the hospital. The doctor couldn't believe what he saw next. Buddy wasn't just any stray dog. For the hospital staff and patients, he had become a silent but familiar figure, a presence that roamed the grounds as if he too belonged there. He wasn't known to stay close to people for long, yet he was a comforting sight, often seen lounging by the entrance or resting by the parking lot, as though he were standing guard. When he wasn't searching for food scraps, Buddy could be found watching visitors come and go, his watchful eyes taking in every detail. He wasn't a young dog, nor was he old. His fur, a rough mix of brown and white patches, was marked with signs of his life on the streets. His ears were alert, constantly tuned to the sounds around him, and his face bore a certain wisdom, an understanding that had come from years of living on his own. In the quiet hours of the night, he was the only creature roaming the hospital grounds, his presence a lonely silhouette under the streetlights. The nurses had grown used to him, calling him Buddy as if he were an old friend. Some of them would leave out leftovers or scraps, knowing he would find them in the early hours of the morning. For a few minutes, they'd watch him eat, feeling a strange comfort in his silent loyalty. Despite his independence, he always returned, as though drawn by an invisible bond to the hospital and the people within. To Buddy, the hospital grounds were more than a source of food and shelter. They were familiar. There was a sense of safety in the walls that surrounded it, in the people who cared for others. He couldn't explain why he lingered there, but he had come to know the routine of the place, sensing the quiet, the restlessness, and the faint echoes of lives intertwined with his own. And though he had no one to call his family, Buddy somehow felt a quiet duty to the place. But that night was different. The air was colder, the shadows darker, and Buddy felt a strange tension he couldn't shake. He moved quietly along the edge of the hospital, his steps cautious. The usually comforting silence held a weight to it, a feeling of something waiting, hidden in the dark. He sniffed the air, his senses picking up a faint scent, something unfamiliar and unsettling. He followed the scent to the back of the hospital where the dumpsters sat. Buddy's ears perked up as he heard a faint sound, a soft, muffled cry. He moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest. There, near the base of one of the dumpsters, he found it, a small, wrapped bundle that seemed almost lost in the shadows. And from within that bundle came the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. Buddy felt an urgency he'd never known before. He leaned down, sniffing the bundle carefully, sensing the fragility and the desperation within it. Without thinking, he began to bark, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the quiet night. He circled the bundle, barking and whining, his instincts urging him to get help, to alert someone, anyone, to the tiny life fighting to survive. His barking caught the attention of a young nurse finishing her late shift. She hesitated, recognizing the familiar figure of Buddy, but as his barks grew more frantic, she hurried towards him. She could see his body tense, his gaze fixed on the bundle at his feet. And then she heard it, the faint, desperate cry. "Oh my God," she whispered, kneeling beside the bundle. She lifted it carefully, peeling back the layers of cloth to reveal the baby's tiny face, blue with cold. The baby was barely moving, its cries weak but insistent, as though clinging to life by sheer will. The nurse's heart raced as she looked up at Buddy, his gaze steady, his eyes full of a wisdom beyond her understanding. She rose quickly, holding the baby close to her chest to keep it warm. Buddy followed her every step, his gaze never leaving her. She rushed through the hospital's emergency doors, where other nurses and doctors quickly gathered. They whisked the baby away into the warm, sterile light of the hospital, beginning immediate life-saving measures. Buddy sat just inside the doors, watching them go, his eyes fixed on the place where they had disappeared. The nurse, in a moment of realization, looked back at him and whispered, "You saved him, Buddy. You saved a life tonight." The hospital's emergency room bustled with energy as doctors and nurses rallied to stabilize the baby. They moved quickly, layering the tiny body with warm blankets and connecting it to a monitor that beeped softly. The baby's breathing was shallow but steadying, a fragile rhythm that mirrored the relief spreading through the room. Meanwhile, Buddy lingered at the entrance of the hospital, pacing back and forth. He was used to observing quietly, but tonight was different. His actions had set something in motion, and though he didn't understand it, he sensed that he was needed here, even if he couldn't quite see why. Nurse Hannah, the one who had first discovered the baby with Buddy, returned to the entrance, her face a mix of worry and awe. She knelt down beside Buddy, patting his head with a soft, trembling hand. "I don't know how you found that baby," she murmured, her eyes searching his. "But you may have just saved a life tonight, old boy." Buddy looked back at her, his eyes steady, and gave a small whine as if responding. Something in him seemed to understand her gratitude. He nudged her hand gently, then returned to his vigil, his gaze fixed on the doors of the emergency room as if guarding the life he'd just discovered. Inside, the doctors worked diligently, led by Dr. Aaron Collins, the head of the emergency team. Dr. Collins had seen many cases come through these doors, but something about this tiny, abandoned child struck him deeply. The baby was wrapped in mismatched cloths, layers that had failed to keep it warm in the cold night air. His heart clenched at the thought of what could drive someone to leave a newborn alone in such conditions. As he carefully examined the baby, he noticed a small mark on its left shoulder, a birthmark in the shape of a faint, irregular crescent. He paused, his thoughts scattering as memories stirred in his mind. The mark was oddly familiar, reminiscent of another he had once known. Dr. Collins shook his head, pushing the thought aside. Focus, he told himself, returning his attention to the present. But the mark remained in his thoughts, lingering like a shadow, hinting at a mystery he couldn't ignore. The baby's condition stabilized, and the relief was palpable. Nurses exchanged glances, their expressions softening as they saw the baby's color returning, a pink warmth replacing the bluish tone from earlier. The room felt lighter, as though the infant's struggle for survival had uplifted them all. After ensuring the baby was safe, Dr. Collins stepped out to the reception area, his mind still spinning. He found Nurse Hannah, who was leaning against the wall, her hand absently scratching Buddy behind the ears. The dog sat calmly beside her, his eyes watchful, as if he understood that his role wasn't over. "Is the baby going to be okay?" Hannah asked, her voice low. Dr. Collins nodded, his face softening. "Yes. Thanks to your quick action, and Buddy's discovery, the baby's stable for now. We'll need to run some more tests, but it looks like we found him just in time." Hannah looked down at Buddy, giving him an affectionate pat. "See, boy? You're a hero tonight." Buddy's tail gave a slight wag, his eyes still fixed on Dr. Collins as if he too were waiting for answers. Dr. Collins crouched down, studying Buddy with curiosity. "I don't know how you knew, but you've given this baby a chance," he said softly, as if confiding in the dog. Buddy simply stared back, his eyes dark and understanding, an almost human depth to his gaze. A few hours passed, and as dawn broke over the hospital, the events of the night left an unshakable impact on everyone involved. Buddy, who typically roamed off by sunrise, remained stationed at the hospital entrance, his gaze never wavering from the doors. Seeing his dedication, Hannah decided to let Buddy into the waiting area. As she led him through the doors, a few of the staff stopped to admire him, murmuring words of praise and gratitude for the stray who had become an unexpected hero. With the morning shift arriving, news of the rescue spread through the hospital. Doctors and nurses paused in their routines to acknowledge Buddy, some offering him treats, others a gentle scratch behind the ears. It was as if Buddy had been anointed the guardian of the hospital, his presence filling the air with a renewed sense of purpose. But Dr. Collins couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. That birthmark had stirred something in him, a faint echo from years past that he couldn't ignore. He knew he needed answers both for the baby and for himself. By mid-morning, Dr. Collins contacted the local authorities, filing a report on the abandoned baby. The police arrived to document the case and initiate an investigation, but as they interviewed the staff, they found themselves drawn to Buddy's story. Even the officers couldn't help but be impressed by the stray dog's loyalty and instinct. Before they left, one of the officers crouched down beside Buddy. "Good work, boy," he murmured, scratching the dog's head. Buddy remained still, but his eyes conveyed something deeply knowing, as if he understood the significance of what had just unfolded. When the officers left, Dr. Collins stood in the quiet corridor, his mind still filled with unanswered questions. He couldn't explain why, but he felt a sense of connection to this child, a connection rooted not in logic but in something instinctive and emotional. And as he looked toward the waiting area, where Buddy sat calmly by the door, Dr. Collins felt an unspoken understanding pass between them. With one final look at the newborn resting peacefully in the nursery, Dr. Collins turned to Nurse Hannah. "Let's make sure Buddy stays close," he said quietly. "Something tells me his part in this story isn't over." Hannah nodded, smiling softly as she glanced at Buddy. "He's already made this place his home. I don't think he's going anywhere." Buddy settled into his new role, lying down near the entrance, his eyes ever watchful. Though he didn't know it, he had changed more than one life that night, and perhaps in his own quiet way, he understood the significance of his actions. And as the sun rose over the hospital, illuminating the walls in a soft, golden light, Buddy's journey was only just beginning. The nursery was quiet as the baby lay sleeping in his crib, surrounded by warmth and soft blankets. Under the tender care of the nurses and doctors, his fragile breathing had stabilized, and his cheeks had begun to show a faint, healthy pink. Buddy, however, remained restless, his gaze fixated on the door leading to the nursery, as though his job was far from over. Nurse Hannah, now off her shift but too invested to leave, sat beside Buddy, stroking his fur in silent gratitude. "You did good, Buddy," she whispered, smiling. "You really did." But Buddy's eyes remained on the door as though he were waiting for something more, some deeper, unspoken resolution. In his office, Dr. Collins sat at his desk, reviewing the baby's chart. But his mind kept drifting back to the mark on the baby's shoulder, an oddly familiar shape. It reminded him of a time he had tried to forget, a part of his life that still haunted him. Leaning back in his chair, he closed his eyes and let the memories return, unbidden. Years ago he had lost his daughter, Grace. She had been young, bright, and full of life, but her path had veered toward danger and struggle, leading her to a life he couldn't reach or help her escape from. She had disappeared one night, and though Dr. Collins had searched and grieved, she was never found. He had always wondered if she'd survived, if she'd made a life somewhere unknown to him. The birthmark on the baby's shoulder was almost identical to the one Grace had, an unusual crescent shape that he had only seen once before. The mark had stirred something in him, a suspicion he knew was irrational, yet impossible to ignore. He pushed the thought aside. There were practical matters to address first. Dr. Collins had spoken to social services and knew that arrangements for the baby's placement would be made soon. Still, his intuition told him to remain close, and he resolved to keep an eye on the child until then. The morning passed slowly, with nurses, staff, and even a few patients pausing to visit the nursery and catch a glimpse of the baby who had been miraculously saved. Word of Buddy's heroic act had spread, and the hospital staff had accepted him as their unofficial guardian. In the waiting area, patients would pet him and the nurses would slip him treats. Buddy accepted the attention but seemed always to return to his watchful post, sensing the importance of his presence there. Later that day, as Dr. Collins checked in on the nursery, he saw Buddy lying by the door, alert and silent. "You're not leaving, are you?" he murmured, looking down at Buddy. The dog's steady gaze met his, and Dr. Collins felt a strange sense of reassurance, as if the dog shared his concerns. He reached down, patting Buddy's head, his mind still clouded with thoughts of the past. Just as he was about to turn away, Nurse Hannah appeared, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Dr. Collins," she began hesitantly, "I know it might seem strange, but you said the birthmark on the baby's shoulder was familiar to you. Could it be connected to someone from your family?" Dr. Collins hesitated, surprised by her perceptiveness. "It's unlikely," he admitted, though his voice held an unspoken hope. "But there are moments that make you wonder." Hannah nodded, sensing the weight of his emotions. "It's a small miracle that Buddy found him," she said quietly. "Maybe there's more to it than we can understand." Dr. Collins agreed, though he kept his doubts hidden. The logical side of him fought against the hope blooming in his heart, warning him not to let his emotions take over. But as he glanced down at Buddy, he couldn't deny the sense that fate had played a role in bringing this baby to him. Meanwhile, in the nursery, the baby's condition continued to improve, and by the afternoon he was awake, his small fingers curling and uncurling as he gazed at the unfamiliar world around him. Dr. Collins watched from the doorway, feeling a strange connection to the child he couldn't quite explain. The nurses, too, were captivated by the infant's resilience, each of them taking turns to soothe him and make him comfortable. By evening, the staff had grown attached to both the baby and Buddy. A decision was made to allow Buddy to remain in the nursery's waiting area for the night, giving him the freedom to be near the baby he had saved. And so, Buddy curled up on a soft blanket by the nursery door, his head resting on his paws, his eyes never straying far from the child. Dr. Collins stayed late that night, alternating between his office and the nursery. His mind was restless, filled with unanswered questions and memories he thought he had buried long ago. Around midnight, he found himself back in the nursery watching the baby as he slept. The peaceful rise and fall of the child's tiny chest calmed him, a quiet reminder of life's fragility. Buddy lifted his head, watching Dr. Collins with an intensity that seemed to hold a silent understanding. In that quiet moment, Dr. Collins felt a bond, not only with Buddy but with the baby, a child whose presence was a mystery yet to be solved. As he left the nursery, Dr. Collins resolved to take the next step in unraveling that mystery. He would conduct a DNA test, if only to put his mind at ease. He needed to know if the child was connected to him, if this tiny life, rescued by a faithful dog, was somehow tied to his lost family. He walked back to his office, his mind buzzing with possibilities, while Buddy lay back down, resuming his silent vigil. Tomorrow would bring answers, but tonight Dr. Collins felt the heavy pull of hope, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. And as the hospital settled into the quiet of the early hours, he whispered a silent prayer, grateful for the life they had saved and the loyal dog who had brought it to them. The following morning dawned bright and cold, filling the hospital with a soft, filtered light. Dr. Collins, having barely slept, was already up, focused on a decision he had made overnight. He wanted answers, and the only way to find them was through a DNA test. Though he knew it would raise questions, he felt compelled to proceed. The thought of a possible connection to his daughter gnawed at him, an idea he couldn't shake despite his own disbelief. After gathering the necessary samples discreetly, Dr. Collins sent them to the lab, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. As he waited for the results, he threw himself into his work, hoping to find distraction in his rounds. But every time he passed the nursery, he found himself pausing, glancing through the glass to where the baby lay, tiny and peaceful. The mark on the child's shoulder flashed in his mind, filling him with both hope and anxiety. Meanwhile, Buddy had settled into his new role with quiet dignity. He remained near the nursery, watchful and calm, as though he understood that his journey with the baby was far from over. The hospital staff continued to treat him as a beloved guardian, and even the patients began to regard him as a source of comfort. Each morning, Buddy was there, eyes fixed on the doors of the nursery, his presence a constant reminder of the miracle he had brought to them. As the hours ticked by, Dr. Collins grew restless. His mind kept replaying memories of his daughter, Grace, her laughter, her resilience, and her troubled path that had taken her away from him. He had searched for years, reaching out to shelters and organizations, holding on to hope, but as the years passed, he was forced to accept that she was gone. Now, the arrival of this baby and the strange familiarity of the birthmark had reawakened a part of him he had buried long ago. Late in the afternoon, Dr. Collins received a call from the lab. His heart skipped a beat as he picked up the phone, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. The lab technician's words were concise, but they hit him like a tidal wave. The DNA test had confirmed a familial connection. The child was, without a doubt, his grandson. Dr. Collins sank into his chair, his mind spinning. The reality of it washed over him in waves, leaving him both exhilarated and heartbroken. His daughter, who he had thought lost forever, had left behind this tiny miracle, a life that carried her legacy forward. The weight of his grief mingled with overwhelming joy, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry, tears of both sorrow and gratitude. After composing himself, he knew he had to share the news with someone who had been there from the beginning. He found Nurse Hannah, who had stayed close to the baby's care since that first night. Her eyes widened as he explained, her hands covering her mouth in shock. "Your grandson?" she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "Dr. Collins, I can't believe it. It's like fate brought him to you." Dr. Collins nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I think Buddy knew," he said softly, glancing down the hall where the dog lay in his usual spot, his gaze unwavering. "In some way he brought my family back to me." Hannah's face softened as she looked at Buddy, understanding the deep, unspoken bond between the doctor, the dog, and the child. "What will you do now?" she asked, sensing the weight of the decision that lay ahead. Dr. Collins hesitated, his gaze drifting back toward the nursery. "I need to keep him close," he murmured, almost to himself. "He's family. I don't know what happened to Grace, but I owe it to her to give this baby a home, to give him the life she might have wanted for him." The revelation rippled through the hospital, though the details remained private. Staff and nurses, sensing the significance of the bond between Dr. Collins and the child, offered quiet support, each of them moved by the miraculous way fate had intervened. In the days that followed, Dr. Collins began to make arrangements to adopt the baby officially. He worked closely with social services, and with the support of the hospital, he was granted temporary guardianship. As he held his grandson in his arms for the first time, he felt a sense of completion he had never known. This child, so vulnerable and innocent, represented a second chance. A chance to heal the wounds of the past and rebuild a family he had once lost. Buddy continued to be an unwavering presence, watching over the baby with an almost paternal protectiveness. Each morning, as Dr. Collins arrived, he would find Buddy at the nursery door, as though awaiting his arrival. And every night, as the hospital quieted, Buddy would lie down beside the crib, his watchful gaze never leaving the child. One evening, as Dr. Collins sat by the crib, he reached down to pat Buddy's head, his voice barely above a whisper. "You brought him to me, didn't you, old boy? You knew he needed a family." Buddy looked up at him, his eyes filled with a silent understanding, as though acknowledging the words with a gentle nod. In those quiet moments, Dr. Collins felt a profound sense of gratitude, not only for his grandson but for Buddy, the dog who had bridged the gap between loss and hope. Together, they had found something precious, something worth fighting for, and in that moment, Dr. Collins knew he would do whatever it took to protect this child and give him the life he deserved. As the hospital lights dimmed, Dr. Collins stood, watching his grandson sleep. The baby's tiny fingers curled around his own, a fragile yet unbreakable bond. And just outside the nursery, Buddy lay watching, his presence a testament to the loyalty and love that had brought them together. With a deep breath, Dr. Collins knew their journey was only beginning. Buddy quickly became the heart and soul of the hospital, a steadfast guardian who never left his post near the nursery. His presence was more than comforting, it was inspiring. Patients and staff alike began to look forward to seeing him each day, his calm demeanor and watchful eyes providing a sense of peace and assurance that seemed to touch everyone who crossed his path. The doctors and nurses admired Buddy's dedication to the baby. It was as if he understood the significance of his role, that he was there to protect the child he had found on that cold night. They left treats and blankets for him, and a small bed was placed in the corner of the waiting area, where he could rest between his self-imposed shifts. Yet, Buddy rarely slept deeply. He was always alert, watching for any sign that his presence might be needed. Nurse Hannah, who had been there from the beginning, often spent her breaks with Buddy. She would sit beside him, scratching behind his ears and talking to him as though he were an old friend. "You're a hero, you know that?" she would say, her voice soft with affection. "I don't know how you found him, but you saved that baby. You gave him a chance." Buddy would respond with a gentle nudge or a slow wag of his tail, his eyes warm and understanding. Hannah sometimes wondered if Buddy's journey to the hospital had been guided by something beyond instinct, as if he were a messenger sent to bridge the gap between the child and the family he didn't know he had. In the days that followed, the bond between Buddy and the baby grew stronger. Dr. Collins, now the baby's legal guardian, spent as much time as possible with his grandson, whom he named James after his own father. The name felt right, a tribute to family and the legacy they shared. Buddy's loyalty and love for James became part of the baby's daily routine, an unspoken promise of protection that Dr. Collins deeply appreciated. Word of Buddy's heroic act spread through the local community, and soon visitors began stopping by the hospital just to see him. They would bring small gifts or food, leaving tokens of gratitude for the dog who had changed so many lives. Buddy, though humble in his ways, seemed to understand the affection directed at him, accepting the attention with quiet dignity. One afternoon, a local newspaper caught wind of Buddy's story. A reporter visited the hospital, writing a feature on Buddy, the hero dog, and sharing his journey with the town. The story touched hearts, and soon people from neighboring areas visited, drawn to the hospital by the tale of a stray dog who had found and saved an abandoned child. For many, Buddy became a symbol of hope, a reminder that compassion and loyalty could emerge from the most unexpected places. Dr. Collins, though a private man, welcomed the positive attention. He understood that Buddy's story held meaning beyond the walls of the hospital. It represented something pure, something unbreakable. In the wake of loss, Buddy's actions had brought healing, not only for himself but for the child and those who loved him. Every time Dr. Collins looked at Buddy, he felt a surge of gratitude and respect, knowing that this animal had changed his life in ways he could never repay. As the weeks passed, Buddy's role at the hospital became official. He was given an honorary collar and tag, engraved with his name and title, Buddy, Guardian of the Hospital. The staff threw a small celebration, gathering in the waiting area with cupcakes, balloons, and treats just for Buddy. The celebration was modest but heartfelt, a tribute to the dog who had given them all a new perspective on love and loyalty. Buddy seemed to understand that he was being honored. His tail wagged as he moved from person to person, accepting pats and gentle words of praise. The children in the hospital, many of whom were facing their own battles, found comfort in his presence. Some would even request to seek the hero dog during their visits, and Buddy would sit patiently, offering his calm gaze and gentle presence as a balm for their fears. But despite the attention and praise, Buddy's focus never wavered from James. Each day he returned to his place outside the nursery, lying down and watching, his eyes soft and vigilant. For Buddy, the celebration was secondary. His duty to the baby remained his priority. On quiet nights, when the hospital was still and the corridors were empty, Dr. Collins would sit beside Buddy in the nursery, watching his grandson sleep. The peace he felt in those moments was profound, a sense of completion that had eluded him for so long. Buddy's loyalty and love reminded him that family could be found in the most unexpected places, and that bonds of the heart were sometimes stronger than those of blood. As winter turned to spring, the hospital staff began to notice changes in both Dr. Collins and Buddy. Dr. Collins, once reserved and focused solely on work, now moved with a lighter heart, his once somber expression softened by the joy of being a grandfather. And Buddy, who had once wandered the streets alone, now seemed to have found his purpose and his place, a family and a mission that gave his life meaning. On the first warm day of spring, the hospital held a small gathering in the courtyard. Staff, patients, and community members joined together to celebrate Buddy's story and to honor the bond between him, Dr. Collins, and little James. The courtyard was filled with laughter and joy, a celebration not only of a hero dog but of the resilience of the human spirit. As the crowd dispersed and the hospital returned to its usual calm, Buddy settled back into his spot by the nursery, content. He watched as Dr. Collins held James close, his face radiant with pride and love. The journey that had begun on a cold, lonely night had brought them all to this place, a place of healing, of hope, and of new beginnings. And as Buddy lay down, closing his eyes for a well-deserved rest, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Days turned into weeks, and the routine at the hospital took on a peaceful rhythm. Dr. Collins, now officially the guardian of his grandson James, felt a warmth and fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. Each morning, he would arrive early to greet Buddy, who never left his post by the nursery, watching over James with unwavering loyalty. It was as if Buddy understood that his mission was far from over and that his purpose extended beyond the night he had found the abandoned child. The peace, however, was soon disrupted by a letter that arrived unexpectedly. It was late afternoon when Nurse Hannah approached Dr. Collins in the hallway, holding an envelope with a return address he hadn't seen in years. His heart raced as he took it from her hands. "This arrived in the mail today, Dr. Collins," she said softly, her expression reflecting a mixture of concern and curiosity. As Dr. Collins looked down, the sight of the familiar handwriting brought memories rushing back. It was from Grace, his daughter, the very daughter he had believed lost. Shaking, he tore open the envelope and began reading, his eyes scanning the words with a mixture of disbelief and hope. In the letter, Grace explained the years she had spent away, her struggles, and the choices she had made that had eventually led her to leave. She apologized for the pain she had caused him, admitting that she had felt unworthy of his love, that she'd feared he could never forgive her. But the most heart-wrenching revelation came at the end of the letter. She had been pregnant and had left to protect her child, fearing that her past would bring only hardship to her baby's life. Tears filled Dr. Collins' eyes as he read her words. She had gone to great lengths to keep her baby safe, yet somehow fate had brought him into Dr. Collins' care regardless. The letter offered no clues as to where she was now. It seemed she had written it years before but never sent it. For reasons he couldn't know, the letter had found its way to him at this precise moment, as though guided by forces beyond understanding. Nurse Hannah watched him, sensing the depth of his turmoil. "Are you all right, Dr. Collins?" she asked, her voice gentle. He looked up, his face etched with a mixture of sorrow and relief. "It's from Grace," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. She left because she thought she was protecting her child. She wanted him to have a better life." Hannah placed a comforting hand on his arm. "And now you're giving him that life. Maybe this was meant to be. Maybe Grace wanted you to find him." Dr. Collins nodded, the weight of the letter settling into his heart. There were so many questions left unanswered, so many moments he had lost. Yet as he looked down the hallway toward the nursery, he knew that his grandson's presence was in itself an answer, a piece of grace that had returned to him, a connection to the daughter he had once thought lost. That evening, as the hospital quieted down, Dr. Collins found himself drawn to the nursery. He stood by James's crib, watching his grandson's tiny chest rise and fall in peaceful slumber. Buddy lay nearby, his gaze steady as ever, a silent guardian in the shadows. Dr. Collins reached down, patting Buddy's head, feeling a swell of gratitude for the dog who had brought them together. "You found him for me, Buddy," he whispered. "And somehow Grace is with us too." Buddy looked up at him, his eyes calm and understanding, as though he recognized the depth of Dr. Collins's emotions. In the soft glow of the nursery light, Dr. Collins felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as though Grace herself were watching over them, her spirit woven into the very fabric of their lives. Over the next few days, Dr. Collins carried Grace's letter with him, reading it during quiet moments, absorbing every word as though they were pieces of her he was reclaiming. He found himself confiding in Buddy, speaking aloud in the solitude of the nursery, his voice filled with both longing and solace. "I missed so much, Buddy," he would say softly. "But I've been given this second chance. I'll make sure James has the life she wanted for him." Buddy would listen, his gaze unwavering, his presence a reminder that love could come in many forms. Some seen, others felt only in the heart. News of the letter spread quietly among the hospital staff, and they too felt the significance of the moment. Many had come to see James as more than just a baby rescued from the cold. He was now a symbol of hope, resilience, and the enduring bond of family. Some of the nurses would stop by the nursery just to sit with him, sharing in the silent vigil that Buddy and Dr. Collins kept, finding comfort in the quiet strength the baby radiated. One afternoon, as Dr. Collins was finishing his rounds, a group of local families arrived at the hospital, bringing donations and gifts for James. They had read about Buddy's story in the paper and wanted to support the child who had touched so many hearts. They brought blankets, toys, and cards filled with messages of love and encouragement, transforming the nursery into a space filled with warmth and kindness. Dr. Collins watched, deeply moved by the community's response. "Thank you," he told them, his voice choked with emotion. "You've given us more than we could ever ask for." As the families left, Buddy moved to his usual spot by James's crib, settling down with a sense of purpose. Dr. Collins knelt beside him, his hand resting on the dog's head, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. They were family now, bound not by blood, but by love and loyalty, two guardians united by a child who had brought light back into their lives. That night, as Dr. Collins prepared to leave, he lingered in the nursery, his heart heavy yet full. He looked at Buddy, who had already made himself comfortable for another night of watchful waiting, his eyes calm and assured. Dr. Collins felt the presence of his daughter in every corner of the room, a warmth that transcended words. "I'll take care of him, Grace," he whispered, the words both a promise and a farewell. "And Buddy, he'll be with us every step of the way." The hospital had become more than just a place of healing. It was now a sanctuary of family, of connection, and of love that extended beyond the bounds of life and loss. As Dr. Collins turned off the light and left the nursery, he felt a quiet certainty settle within him. With Buddy by his side and James in his arms, Dr. Collins knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. They had found their way to each other against all odds, and together they would carry on, honoring Grace's memory and building a life filled with love and hope. In the weeks that followed, Dr. Collins embraced his role as both father and grandfather to James. The decision to adopt the baby had transformed him, reigniting a sense of purpose that had been absent from his life for so long. Each day was a new chance to create the family he had once lost, a chance to build a future filled with hope, love, and healing. The adoption process moved swiftly, thanks to the support of the hospital and the community, and soon James was officially part of Dr. Collins's family. The weight of his title, father and grandfather, brought both responsibility and pride. Dr. Collins no longer moved through the hospital with the detachment of a dedicated doctor, but with the warmth of a man who had been given a second chance. Buddy, as ever, remained close to James, his loyalty unbreakable. Now officially recognized as the hospital's guardian, Buddy had his own little bed near James's crib in the nursery. Each night, he would curl up nearby, watching over James with the same intensity and devotion that had guided him on that fateful night. In Buddy's presence, Dr. Collins felt assured. He knew James was in safe hands, or rather safe paws. Every morning, as Dr. Collins prepared for his day, he would find Buddy at his side, waiting patiently for James to wake. Together they had created a routine. Dr. Collins would hold James, feeding and comforting him as Buddy sat by their side, always attentive. When it was time for Dr. Collins to begin his rounds, James would stay in the nursery, where Buddy would resume his watch, comforting the baby with his silent presence. The hospital staff had come to know James and Buddy as symbols of resilience, and patients would often stop by the nursery to see the hospital dog and the baby who had brought them all closer together. Children who were nervous or scared would visit the nursery, finding comfort in Buddy's calming energy. He had become a healer in his own way, offering a form of support that went beyond medicine. As the seasons shifted, Dr. Collins began to notice subtle changes within himself. The sorrow that had once weighed him down, the grief he had carried for his daughter, started to lift. It wasn't that he had forgotten Grace, rather he felt her presence in every moment he spent with James. She was there in his grandson's tiny smiles, in the way he reached for Dr. Collins's hand, and in the peaceful sleep that came with Buddy watching over him. One crisp spring morning, as Dr. Collins held James and looked out over the city from his office window, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life had given him another chance to experience fatherhood, to nurture and protect someone who would carry on Grace's legacy. He vowed to honor that chance with everything he had. But the past still lingered, a shadow he couldn't entirely escape. There were moments, especially in the quiet of the evening, when he wondered what had happened to Grace, where she had gone, and why she hadn't reached out before her final days. He had so many unanswered questions, but with each day the ache of the unknown lessened, replaced by the joy of raising her son. The support of the hospital staff and the community around him had also helped Dr. Collins find peace. They had rallied around him, providing everything from baby clothes and formula to meals that eased his transition into full-time fatherhood. The bond between him, James, and Buddy had become a source of inspiration, a reminder of how even the most broken hearts could be mended. One evening, as Dr. Collins finished his rounds, he found himself drawn to the nursery, where Buddy lay curled up by James's crib. The baby was fast asleep, his tiny hands clutching a soft blanket as he breathed softly. Dr. Collins felt a surge of emotion as he watched them, a wave of gratitude for the unexpected family that had formed around him. He sat down beside Buddy, running his hand through the dog's fur, his voice barely a whisper. "You brought him to me, Buddy. Without you, I might have never known my grandson. You've given me a gift I can never repay." Buddy looked up at him, his gaze calm and knowing, as though he understood the depth of Dr. Collins's words. For the first time in years, Dr. Collins felt a sense of contentment, a feeling that he had found his way home. And as Buddy settled back down, Dr. Collins leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of the past finally lifting from his shoulders. As spring deepened, life at the hospital took on a new rhythm. Buddy was a familiar presence, known and loved by all, and James continued to grow, his cheerful spirit brightening the days of everyone who saw him. Dr. Collins, once dedicated solely to his work, now found himself balancing his role as a doctor with his responsibilities as a father. It was a challenge, but one he welcomed wholeheartedly. On weekends, Dr. Collins would take James and Buddy to the park, where they would enjoy the fresh air and the warmth of the sun. Buddy would trot beside the stroller, his tail wagging as he kept a watchful eye on his charge, while Dr. Collins pushed James, enjoying the simple pleasure of being a father. One afternoon, as they sat on a park bench, Dr. Collins thought of Grace, of the life she might have led, of the decisions that had taken her away. But instead of sorrow, he felt gratitude. In his heart, he knew she had done her best to protect her son, and that in the end she had brought him back to the family she loved. Dr. Collins looked down at James, who gazed up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "We're going to be all right, little one," he whispered, his voice full of hope. "We have each other and we have Buddy. Together we're a family." Buddy, sensing the emotion in Dr. Collins's voice, rested his head on the doctor's knee, his steady presence a reminder of all they had endured and all they had yet to experience. And as they sat together in the warmth of the afternoon sun, Dr. Collins knew that despite everything he had been given a second chance. A chance to love, to heal, and to create a legacy that honored both the past and the future. Back at the hospital, as night fell and the quiet settled over the halls, Buddy resumed his place by James's crib. Dr. Collins too stayed close, feeling the peace of a new beginning. Together they had faced the darkness, and together they would walk forward, their lives forever entwined by love, loyalty, and the miracle of a second chance. Spring had given way to summer, and life at the hospital continued with its usual rhythm. But for Dr. Collins, James, and Buddy, every day felt like a new adventure. With James growing stronger and happier, his cheerful spirit filled each day with light. Dr. Collins marveled at how much his grandson had changed his life, transforming moments that once felt empty into a series of cherished memories. Buddy had become more than just the hospital's guardian. He was now part of the Collins family, a steadfast protector who followed James wherever he went. The hospital staff embraced Buddy's role with warmth, ensuring he had everything he needed, from treats and meals to his own small bed in the nursery, though he preferred sleeping near James's crib whenever possible. On weekends, Dr. Collins continued the tradition of taking James and Buddy to the park. They became a familiar sight in the neighborhood, known by locals as the trio with a story that had captured everyone's hearts. People would wave and stop to chat, asking about James and marveling at Buddy's loyalty and intelligence. Buddy accepted the attention graciously, always remaining close to James, his eyes steady and vigilant. As James grew, he developed an unmistakable bond with Buddy. His first words were often directed at the dog, his small hands reaching out to touch Buddy's fur. Buddy, for his part, was endlessly patient, allowing James to tug on his ears or lay against his back, always watching with gentle eyes. Dr. Collins would smile, seeing in Buddy the same unwavering love that had saved James's life months ago. One sunny afternoon, as they sat together on a bench beneath the shade of an old oak tree, Dr. Collins reflected on the journey that had brought them here. He looked down at James, who was nestled contentedly in his lap, and at Buddy lying at his feet, ever the vigilant guardian. He felt a surge of gratitude, not only for his grandson but for the unexpected family they had become. "Thank you, Buddy," he whispered, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "You've given us both a life we didn't know we needed." Buddy looked up, his eyes soft and wise as though acknowledging the depth of Dr. Collins's words. In that quiet moment, Dr. Collins felt a completeness he hadn't known in years. Despite the pain of the past, he had found a new beginning, one that honored his daughter's memory while embracing the future. As the seasons passed, James grew, surrounded by love and support. The staff at the hospital continued to be part of his life, each of them invested in his story, watching him take his first steps and say his first words. Buddy was by his side for every milestone, a constant presence who seemed to understand the significance of each moment. One evening, after a long day at the hospital, Dr. Collins returned to the nursery where James lay asleep. Buddy was there, as always, watching over the child with the same quiet dedication he had shown from the beginning. Dr. Collins sat beside him, resting a hand on Buddy's head. "You've been with us through everything, haven't you?" he murmured, his voice soft. "We're a family because of you, Buddy. And I don't think I could ever repay you for that." Buddy closed his eyes, leaning into Dr. Collins's touch, his loyalty and love spoken in silence. They stayed that way for a while, two guardians joined by a shared journey, their lives forever entwined by the act of saving a child who had brought them both peace. As the months turned into years, James and Buddy continued to grow together, each a vital part of the other's life. The hospital staff often marveled at how the boy and the dog seemed inseparable, as though they shared a bond beyond words. For Dr. Collins, every moment spent with them was a reminder of how love could heal, how it could transcend even the deepest wounds. And though he would never forget the loss of his daughter, he felt her presence with them, a quiet blessing that lingered in the warmth of the sun, in the laughter of his grandson, and in the loyalty of the dog who had brought them all together. In the end, Buddy, Dr. Collins, and James became a family bound not by blood, but by resilience, compassion, and an unbreakable spirit. They had found each other against all odds, and together, they built a life that honored both the past and the promise of a brighter future. As summer faded into fall, the hospital walls seemed warmer, filled with laughter and life. And for those who saw them, Dr. Collins, the devoted grandfather, James, the child filled with hope, and Buddy, the guardian dog who had saved them all, the trio was a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and second chances. Together they walked forward, knowing they had been given a gift, a family found not in the conventional sense, but in a way that was deeper, richer, and more meaningful than any they could have imagined.